We all know or are familiar with who Jesus Christ is. Most of our information about Jesus Christ comes from the four Gospels, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what if I told you that the youngest Gospel, the book of John, was an unreliable account about Jesus? Here are 5 reasons why the book of John is an unreliable Bible book that should not be trusted or taken seriously when discussing the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. Number 1. The book of John is the youngest gospel account and therefore written the furthest away from Jesus' lifetime. Jesus died around 30 to 33 AD in Judea. The book of John was written around 90 to maybe 110 AD. This means that the Apostle John would had to have written the book of John around 60 years after the life of Jesus Christ. While this is possible, it's very unlikely. The people of the first century did not have the technology that we have nowadays, and so lived shorter lives. So the Apostle John was likely dead by the time the book of John was written. Reason number 2. The book of John was probably not written by the Apostle John. At Acts chapter 4, verse 13, we're told that Peter and John were unschooled, ordinary men. The Greek word used for unschooled, I may mispronounce this, it is agrammatoi. Again, might have mispronounced that. I'll pop the word up on screen. Can also be translated as unlettered or illiterate. So Peter and John were likely illiterate, meaning that they would be unable to write a Bible book without assistance from a third party. Also, for people who wonder why we don't have books from the disciples, this explains it. They were unlettered and ordinary men. This also makes it even less likely that the Apostle John wrote the book of John. In fact, the book of John's writer never actually claims to be John within the book. An example of this is at John chapter 21, verses 24 and 25. The writer chooses to stay anonymous, despite the fact that mentioning their position as one of the original 12 disciples would greatly increase their credibility. Number 3. The book of John's purpose is clearly to introduce new theology. There are several Christian theologies that are missing from the synoptic gospels, which are the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If Jesus never established these theologies, then they have no credibility. The book of John gives these Christian theologies credibility by claiming that Jesus was the one who established them, despite their absence in the synoptic gospels. An example of this is the teaching that we need to believe in Jesus to be saved. This is at John chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, and in many other scriptures in the book of John. This is absent from the synoptic gospels, while in the book of John it is heavily emphasized. Introducing new theology isn't inherently bad. Unfortunately, the book of John makes 2 mistakes in doing so, namely points number 4 and 5, which we'll get to. Point number 4. The book of John doesn't harmonize with the synoptic gospels. The books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all harmonize with each other. They tell the story not necessarily exactly the same. There are some minor differences, but for the most part, their stories are incredibly similar. There's a very distinct harmony between all 3 of these books. The book of John, on the other hand, is significantly different when compared to the synoptic gospels. Now, mind you, this isn't inherently bad in of itself, but the end result is that the book of John does not harmonize with the other Gospels. An example of this is found at John chapter 2, verses 19 to 22. Here Jesus claims that if the temple is destroyed, he will rebuild it in 3 days. Jesus never says this in the synoptic gospels. In fact, in the books of Matthew and Mark, this statement is actually a false accusation. It is entirely absent from the book of Luke. Only in the book of John does Jesus say this false accusation. The writer of the book of John tries to address this by saying that the temple Jesus was referring to was actually his body. But what's interesting is that the book's writer never claims that Jesus said this interpretation. Rather, the writer was adding their own interpretation of the statement to the story. On top of not harmonizing with the other Gospels, the book of John also makes another serious mistake. Point number 5. The book of John contradicts other Bible books. The book of John contradicts several other Bible books, in fact. Here are some examples. At John chapter 3, verse 13, it states that no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. This directly contradicts 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 11, where Elijah is described as going up into heaven in a whirlwind. Another point, John says at John chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, that in order to be saved, we have to believe in Jesus. This contradicts the terms for salvation that Jesus set in the synoptic gospels. For example, look up Matthew 7, verse 12, or Mark 10, verses 17 and 18, or Luke chapter 18, verses 18 and 19. I've got a couple more. Matthew 19, verses 16 and 18. Matthew 22, verses 34 to 40. Mark 12, verses 28 to 34. And lastly, Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46. In fact, Matthew 7:21 seems to directly counter John chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. The book of John even seems to contradict itself. Jesus says that he did not come to the earth to judge at John chapter 3, verses 17 and John chapter 8, verses 15. But in different verses, he contradicts this, and he says that he did, in fact, come to judge. This is at John chapter 9, verse 39, John chapter 5, verse 27, and John chapter 5, verse 22. So the book of John even contradicts itself, and not even once or twice, but multiple times. Now, mind you, this was just 5. There are other problems with the book of John. But the point of this article, the point of this video, is just to name a few of the issues with the book of John. It is not a reliable account of the life of Jesus Christ.